So let's talk through the strongest and weakest creations of the Hive fleets with a tier list of Tyranid units and datasheets in 10th edition 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids, and in this video we're ranking Tyranid units for power, going through each unit that they can field in 10th and roughly how good I think they are right now and for what purposes. Lots has changed since the Tyranids first came out in 10th edition, particularly in Games Workshop's enormous digital update for Pariah Nexus. I think it has given Tyranid armies a bit of a new lease of life. It seemed very appropriate to repeat the Tyranid tier list, or Tyranid list as I'm reliably informed it is called. Since the big Pariah Nexus update, Games Workshop really did change a lot of things around for the Tyranids. Synapse being more useful, a bunch of keywords added, and a fair few direct datasheet buffs were all rather nice, and since that happened they seem to be in a fairly good place, back to around about a 50% sort of win rate, and have won one grand tournament since the update came out. People seem to be having good success with Invasion Fleets, Vanguard Onslaught, and Synaptic Nexus, maybe to a slightly lesser extent. For the armies that they're choosing to run, all three of those give you some pretty general purpose and fairly strong buffs, the Vanguard Onslaught being datasheet locked, but at least it affects a fairly wide array of units in the Codex. Unending Swarm really does seem to have dropped off in popularity due to Games Workshop breaking their reinforcement style stratagem, so you don't just have the guarantees that you can repeatedly swarm people with wave upon wave of Tyranids, and a bit of a shame that the Unending Swarm does have an end now. It's kind of a shame what they did for that one, as I didn't really think it was too overpowered or anything, but at least they're having good success with a bunch of different detachments, which is more than you can say for some armies. For tier lists in Warhammer 40k, they're always a little bit arbitrary. Some things could be ranked a little bit higher or lower depending on your given army and playstyle, plus other things like what terrain set you're playing on, or whether you're playing in a competitive or casual environment. Perhaps the single biggest thing that changes things are detachment choices though. All of them would basically have their own slightly tweaked tier list for units that are a bit more or less useful in each of them. And out of the Tyranid ones, the ones that feel like they skew things the most are probably the Vanguard Onslaught, and I guess the Assimilation Swarm if you're using that one. For the most part, I'm going to try and focus on core datasheet strength, but I'll try and talk about some relevant detachments as we go along. Obviously in Vanguard Onslaught though, basically all the Vanguard invaders get better. In any case though, let's talk through the units, with the bioforms of the Tyranids sorted into 5 rough tiers of power. First up, let's start with some of the weakest datasheets in the Codex. Basically these are the ones that Games Workshop's clearly making no effort to really try and make into good units at all. Fortifications, flyers, and some out there support units just seem to be kind of excluded from balance passes for the most part, at least aside from nerfs if they ever somehow get good. The Spore Assist is an 145 point fortification that spawns a Mucilid Spore within 18 inches each turn. Its damage output and defense are both unfortunately pretty bad for the cost, and its other special rule gives you a little bit of free overwatch, but when you're only averaging around about 1 or 2 strength 5, AP 1 and damage 2 hits per turn from that overwatch, it's not really going to be all that impactful. It's a mobile, so it could be avoided, and it can't forward deploy either as it could in the past. It's OC 0, so it's irrelevant for scoring primary objectives and plenty of action-based secondaries. It just feels like if you wanted both spawning spore mines and then some damage dealing, probably get a Biovore to spawn some mines around the board which would have an even greater range, and then just invest all the save points in something that's actually efficient for dealing damage and having better defense. This one would need to come down in points cost a pretty ridiculous amount if it was going to be considered for competitive play. Next up, we've got the Mucilid Spore and the Spore Mines, 30 points for a Mucilid, and an absolutely ridiculous 55 points for 3 Spore Mines. They can deep strike in, they can screen advanced moves within 6 inches, which can actually be kind of meaningful with stopping opponents reaching primary objectives, and then if they get within 3 inches, they deal a small amount of mortal wounds if they explode. They're usually far less in points than the points that you paid for them. Their objective control 0, so they can't do most secondary objectives. And given their damage doesn't amount to much, I feel like if you wanted small deep striking units that are OC 0, you may as well go for the 25 point Rippers, which will at least take a little bit more focus fire to take down. Realistically, if you want to spawn nuisance mines around the board, then again use the Biovore. It's just a lot better to have one cheap nuisance backfield unit and then multiple units of these appear throughout the game, rather than just pile all the points into one unit that just gets taken down trivially easily, either via shooting or just literally walking straight up to it and accepting the damage as basically the opponent still comes out ahead that way. Finally, for the datasheets I've chosen to rank lowest, there's the Flyers, the Harpy for 215 points and the Hive Chrome for 200 points. As with most flyer type choices in 40k right now, Games Workshop seems to want to point them out of optimised list sort of territory, and these guys are definitely ridiculously overcosted for what they bring. 12 wounds at toughness 9 with a 3+ save is just pretty bad durability for 200 points or more, and the damage output, whether it's the Harpy's Venom Cannon and Spore Mines, or the Hive Crone's Tentaclid's Dual Cannon and the Spur thing, neither of those are anywhere near 200 points worth of damage dealing value. Their biggest advantages are they can move fast and get unusual lines of sight, or maybe do nuisance charges after a 20-inch move, which both could be kind of disruptive, but even accounting for that, they still need to cost really quite a lot less. Kind of a shame they're not even a little bit more usable. They don't even really do objectives well either, given OC 0. Just as a quick aside, if you did want to help support Auspex tactics and keep these videos coming, when you're picking up any Tyranids units or other Warhammer 40k things, I do have a bunch of discount retailers that sell Warhammer down in the video description, usually between 10 and 20% off depending on where you are around the world. They can save some good money versus Games Workshop's prices, and if you do happen to click on the link before buying anything, a small amount of money goes to help support Auspex tactics as well. So a big thank you to anyone using those if you were going to order in something anyway. Onwards and upwards for the Tyranid tiers though, and here's tier 4. Datasheets are considered really quite overshadowed by the rest of them. Hive Guard are 100 points per 3 of them, with basically slow moving gun infantry, with either a bit of indirect fire that's damage 1, or an anti-vehicle AP-1 and damage 3 shot cannon. For the model, they're at least fairly durable, but fairly slow, and a bigger deal if they get locked in melee versus monsters. Their trick is that they can overwatch on a 4+ if they're in range of an objective marker, but you still do need to spend the CP or your Hive Tyrant's discounted stratagem, so that means you have to feed them even more resources just to try and get them to the point where they're sort of okay. In general, if you want Tyranid firepower, monsters with big guns like Maliceptors or Exocrines or even the Tyrannifex now all seem to be the way to go over these. They just have stronger firepower that isn't AP1 or worse, have kind of similar toughness in their own way, and big guns never tire means that they can still sit in melee and still shoot, which is another good advantage. The Toxicrene is 150 points. This one gives you a lot of AP1 and damage 2, anti-infantry 2+ attacks, both at close range and in melee. It is quite a specific damage profile that's good against certain targets, but also weak against quite a lot of things. It'll be strong against things like say 3+ Space Marines or Horde type units, or maybe things like Demon Infantry that rely on their invulnerable saves, but anything that's got a 2+ save and Armour of Contempt really isn't going to care. Or anything that's moderate to high toughness, you're going to be wounding on a 5 and you're just not going to do all that much with it. It does get a quite nice chance to prevent fallback, which occasionally could be really disruptive if it does manage to get into something it shouldn't, and it also has a mortal wound aura at the end of movement phase, which can add a tiny bit of general purpose damage to things nearby. It definitely does have its disadvantages. It only moves 8 inches, which isn't excellent for a big melee damage dealer. The big tendrils can be hard to hide behind cover and might limit where you can put it down on the board, even with the new overhanging models type rule. And the damage output is just less general purpose and easy to use, and you're not often going to be able to dictate what it can charge. It's often just going to need to charge the thing right in front of it, even if it's a really bad target. For that reason, I'd far rather go with things like Old One Eye or maybe a Auspex if you were thinking about one of these. Both of those are cheaper than this guy and are going to be a lot more general purpose, being able to do big damage to big scary battle tanks and things, and not just lighter infantry. Next up, the Tyranid for 105 points is kind of rarely used, though I also do think isn't completely useless. It's basically the Tyranid drop pod for 105 points. It either transports either 20 infantry or 6 big infantry, or a 12 wound or less monster to the board, all on turn 1. They get out and can shoot but not charge, and from there the Tyranid itself can float around doing some chip damage with its bioweapons and its flensing things in melee, and just be a nuisance getting in the way or sitting on objectives with its OC2. I feel like perhaps the biggest negative of this thing is its choice of things to put in it for transport. I feel like if Tyranids had a shooting unit that was really dangerous at 12 inches and was also really fragile and needed delivery like this, then the Tyranid would be perfect for it. But a lot of monsters want to charge or just have the range where they don't really need this as a delivery. They can either sit in the backfield or use strategic reserve potentially and just not come in turn 1. I still say it's not awful though. It could be handy enough to have for some early game secondaries perhaps, and could put an annoying big threat in the middle of the board even if you are paying a premium to do so. Not many Tyranid armies choose to take one of these though. Next up we've got the Harridan with the great big flying Tyranid dragon for 610 points. He's 30 wounds at toughness 10 with a 3+ save and a hover flyer, so can fly around the board at 20 inches per turn unleashing loads of strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3 shooting from 2 dire biocannons that also get a +1 to wound against their targets. He can transport things like a flock of gargoyles if he wants to, and can be a really big scary target for certain stratagems like 5+ feel no pains or anything else that would amplify his damage or durability. He does have some melee as well, which is pretty scary when he can be moving 20 inches across the map, though is OC0 as a flyer. Overall, I think for 610 points his damage output is genuinely scary enough. That strength 10 is really quite general purpose, and being able to charge things could be pretty nasty as well. I think perhaps the biggest weakness with him though is that he just can't really hide with an enormous profile. He's going to struggle to hide behind ruins and things. At toughness 10 and a 3+ save, any sort of long-range focused anti-tank firepower is just going to kill him depressingly easily. If the opponent doesn't have the profiles to destroy him at long range though, then he could be a genuine menace flying around and deleting things while the rest of the army tries to win the missions. Finally, for tier 4 we've got the Hierophant Biotitan. He gets similar sort of biocannon shooting, but a much better defensive profile, toughness 14, a 2+ save with a 5+ invulnerable and 30 wounds once more. Obviously on an individual level he's an enormous threat both at range and in melee, so it's a good target for central stratagems and anything that you can do to buff him. Here's a massive extra 200 points versus the Harridan though, even if it is the upgrade from being super easy to kill to genuinely kind of difficult. So in a 2000 point list you're not really going to have all that much support for him. In competitive play, in a lot of preset terrain things, he's basically unusable just due to the ridiculously enormous profile of those legs. It's going to be hard to move around terrain and things. I think it would have been kind of nice if he'd got the super heavy walker sort of keyword. It seems very reasonable he could have smashed through terrain and things like the knights. Overall, it's not really going to be a particularly competitive model, more for big fun games at that crazy 810 points cost. Realistically, neither his damage nor defense is super outstanding for that enormous price tag, and being unable to interact with certain bits of scenery is really quite a big deal. And between that, you're not going to see many people trying to take one in a 2000 point army list. Moving up to tier 3 now, here the units I consider a bit more usable, either things that are just genuinely pretty handy, but tend to be slightly lesser played than certain other units in the Codex just due to strong competition, or things that might have niche special rules that could be the right choice for certain armies, but the vast majority of Tyranid lists aren't going to be quite as interested. I think all of these at least have something interesting to sell them though. First up we've got the Turvagon, which got a points decrease recently, 175 points for really quite a lot of tanky bug, toughness 11 with a 2+ save and 16 wounds, and provides synapse, all on a monster that's kind of low threat and is probably going to be low priority for the opponent to dedicate that kind of firepower to. The big Broodmother Bug replenishes D3+3 termagants in a unit each turn, which could be combined with things like the Invasion Fleet's Respawn Gaunts type stratagem. They give lethal hits for termagants as well, even if you can get that from Hive Tyrants now, at least at range, and then has a little bit of melee threat. I'd be kind of tempted by the heavy attacks with those claws that can actually chip a bit of damage against tanks and vehicles. Realistically, the Turvagon's become a much more niche unit though. It's best in Unending Swarm, and that did get nerfed. But I still feel even outside that it's not unusable if you are playing big hordes of termagants and you want something to support them and provide some synapse. Next up we've got the Norn Emissary and Norn Assimilator, both of which I think are useful, though I feel like out of the two the Norn Emissary is the one that tends to get considered a lot more for competitive versus the Assimilator. Even if I kind of feel like the Assimilator isn't quite as far behind as a lot of internet discussion would suggest. The Emissary is 275 points and the Assimilator's 290. They're both big toughness 11, 16 wound bugs with a 2+ save. The Emissary is the tougher of the two with a 4+ invulnerable save and a save against mortal wounds as well. I think they both improved a fair bit, getting their base attacks to strength 10 in melee, which is rather nice. They're synapse, so they'll always have that synapse buff on them. And then they get their special rule where you usually nominate a midfield objective. They'll be OC 15 while they're on that objective, so usually that means it's yours, and also get a 5+ feel no pain when they're there. So extra hard for the enemy to chew through that defensive profile, and while they have that active, they're genuinely very tanky for the cost. Beyond that, the Emissary gets its durability rules, is a bit cheaper, and gets some psychic shooting, and the Assimilator foregoes its invulnerable save, but gets a bunch of pretty threatening anti-tank type damage at close range and in melee, so maybe feels a bit less possible to just ignore it. I feel like the invulnerable save matters a lot more against certain armies than others. If the enemy anti-tank has only got something like AP2 or AP3 and you've got cover, it's not going to care at all. and the simulator genuinely is more threat against heavy stuff. Otherwise, they could be interesting for the reroll 1 stratagem in Synaptic Nexus, which I feel like they're big and scary enough to trigger just for themselves. They can swap out their OC15 thing for 4 rerolls against 1 enemy unit if that should be better in the matchup for some reason. And overall, I feel like they're probably in the brackets where they're just generally usable and certainly playable enough casually, but rarely strong enough to make the cut and outcompete the other monsters and things into top lists. I still probably put the Emissary just a little bit ahead for that nasty durability. Though having a bunch of punchy anti-tank on a tough unit in the mid-board definitely isn't the worst thing in the world. Next up, we've got the Von Ryan's Leapers at 75 points per 3 of them. They're an infiltrate unit with mass strength 5, AP 1 and damage 1 attacks and fight first, so can happily blend lighter enemy infantry, but will struggle a bit if they're coming up against anything that's too much tougher than that. They move fairly fast, they're not super tough but do have stealth and get free heroic intervention if it matters. I feel like given their battlefield role, there's a fair few times when it won't really, or they just won't really want to jump into combat with something that charges something nearby. I feel like they're a unit that's just far more usable in the Vanguard Onslaught type detachments with the Vanguard Invader thing. Being able to advance and charge is quite a big deal, or do other sneaky things. I'd rank them higher there. I personally say they're usable enough. I could have probably ranked them either high tier 3 or low tier 2, and maybe high tier 2 in Vanguard Onslaught perhaps. Not too bad as cheapish mid-board skirmishers, though I feel like they are competing with some very good lictor choices that can do a similar sort of role, even if they don't have quite as many wounds or attacks. Next up, we've got the Screamer Killer at 145 points. This tanky Carnifex is toughness 9 with a 2+ save, and as he advances up the board, he's usually not the hardest unit to get cover on if you can prong one of those talons behind a bit of terrain or something. As he moves closer, he has a Scream that's fairly nice against infantry, Strength 8, AP 2 and Damage 1, and it hands out a Battle Shock debuff at -1 to the test, and that could combo really nicely with Neurolictors for their damage buff. If between them and a Neurolictor you can get +1 to wound on an enemy unit, that's going to be quite a big deal. When they reach melee, they have Mass Strength 10, AP 2 and Damage 3 attacks that's very nice against Terminators, and general purpose enough to leave a big mark on anything. Though I feel like with his movement characteristic he's probably going to take at least a fair bit of enemy firepower when he moves up the board before he gets to charge. He isn't quite fast enough to move all the way out of terrain and then make a reliable charge on things that are a long way away. Overall I feel like he's fairly well balanced, strong enough to make it into competitive lists occasionally, but not really all that often. Certainly not a bad unit though. Next up, for 75 points we have the Raveners. 75 points for essentially fast moving warriors without synapse. They get a 10-inch move and a bunch of twin-linked AP1 damage 1 in melee, and they've got a handy rule to burrow on and off the board, deep striking around the board and maybe being able to be in a good place to do actions and things. So a cheap unit might not be the worst secondary support in the world. Otherwise they get the choice between a 4+ save and a small close range shooting attack, and they recently acquired the Vanguard Invader keyword, so suddenly got a lot more better against the competition in that particular detachment. Overall, I definitely feel like they're an interesting unit, if not a super high threat one, as they can't really deal with a bunch of things that have got high saves or high toughness. One unit of them for utility and jumping around the board doing actions and secondaries does seem reasonable enough though. I'd probably say like the Von Ryan's Leapers kind of borderline between high tier 3 or low tier 2. Next up we've got the Tyranid Warriors, 65 points for the ranged version with the sort of hybrid role, or 75 points for the mass twin-linked melee version. I feel like with the points decrease and the synapse buff, Games Workshop has made them to the point where they're not really bad anymore, but still perhaps their durability lets them down to the point where they struggle to be frontline infantry and they aren't super fast either. At toughness 5, 3 wounds and a 4+ save, basically anything in the game will do good damage against them, whether it's a las gun or a las cannon. For the ranged ones, they're just 65 points for really quite a cheap Synapse Skirmisher type unit. Really nice if you just want some extra cheap Synapse on the board. And they do get 6 OC as well, which isn't nothing. Between their shooting and close combat profile, they can deal with enemy light infantry quite well if they get into a one-on-one skirmish. If going big investment, I'll be more tempted by the melee version of them. For a unit of 6 of those for 150 points, they are genuinely quite fighty. 36 attacks at strength 6 with Synapse, AP -2 and damage 1 twin linked. That is going to be enough volume to stack some serious saves, even on toughness 10 or toughness 11 vehicles now. They could potentially augment that with a winged prime if you wanted to. I'd say their damage output is easily good enough to justify the points. They're just not super durable and not super easy to deliver to combat either. They need to make kind of smart use of terrain and make sure that they aren't just hit back horribly in return. Next up, for 25 points, we've got the Rippers, which lost out a fair bit due to being OC0 in the latest update. It means they can't do actions. Despite this, though, I still think that maybe just like one unit of one base of them really isn't the worst thing in the world to have for an army. Just having them pop up and be annoying as a deep strike unit could be quite a good unit just to fill a role screening. Maybe if you've got a gap that's opened up that you need to stop enemies deep striking into, it could well be worth it for that. And they can still do some secondaries as well, such as engage on all fronts, which doesn't need you to do actions or have objective control. If they do wind up in combat with something or an objective, then they can halve their objective control, but given that they're only toughness 2, they might struggle to survive against anything that's got any combat threat. And I feel like they're competing with a Biovore throwing spore mines around for the same sort of small unit disruption type role. I think in general that'd be better. Overall, though, still not absolutely useless for 25 points. Could be worth it if you have that much left over. They are also an assimilation swarm keyworded unit as well, so going to be more relevant there. Next up, we've got the Carnifexes, which I think are kind of interesting. I feel like their base datasheet is just kind of bad on the damage output, but if you throw Old One Eye into the mix to lead them, then it changes them from being pretty low threat to pretty good threat. I'd probably argue that fielded alone they might be tier 4 sort of territory right now, but with Old One Eye along, maybe around about tier 2-ish, so I've chosen to put them in the middle just as a bit of an arbitrary choice. In any case, they have a really flexible loadout. You could go full shooty or full melee or a mix. I've seen people doing all 3 of those. Plus they get a bit of extra volume fire in things like spine banks or bioplasma attacks. I said their durability is just about acceptable at 8 wounds, toughness 9 and a 2+ save, though certainly not standout. But they do have quite a fun rule, which means they basically rush at the foe if they take damage, d6 plus 2-inch movement once per phase if that happens. And that could potentially mess with your opponent's plans a bit, particularly if they jump into combat. It means that if they're next to an objective and the opponent moves up to try and take that objective, they might not be able to rely on themselves not getting instantly mugged by Carnifexes. As mentioned for damage, I think it's a big difference if Old One Eye is there or not. Hitting on a 4+ is just really painful if he isn't, but if you get to re-roll that, then it gets kind of fine. I'd probably be most tempted by 2 of these with Old One Eye if I wanted to use them, maybe with the Death Spitters being kind of fun for a ranged attack, and maybe the big anti-tank crushing claws if you want melee profiles. Next up, we've got the Tyrant Guard, again one of the units out of this section that I'd consider one of the better ones perhaps, particularly with the base Hive Tyrant and Swarm Lord suddenly getting a fair bit more interesting. They're really quite cheap at 85 points per 3 of them, and for that you get 4 wounds at toughness 8 with a 3+ save, so very tanky for 85 points there, particularly with Overkill being a bit of a nuisance for anti-tank weapons that would otherwise really like to shoot them. There's really quite a nice big tough barrier between things like a Hive Tyrant and Swarm Lord taking a whole bunch of firepower. I think at 85 points for the unit of 3, they're really quite reasonable for all the extra durability they bring. I think swap them from being a unit where basically if they're exposed, all the anti-tank guns will be focused on them as a high priority threat, or people having to think whether or not they can realistically destroy 3 Tyrant Guard and a Hive Tyrant all in one shooting phase, or otherwise they're just going to wind up killing some Tyrant Guard this turn and leaving everything else unscathed. They do have a little bit of their own melee damage. I feel like perhaps the Strength 8, AP2 and Damage 2 twin linked profile might be the best, even if it doesn't hit very reliably. In reality, they're mainly here for their defense though, and otherwise could be an interesting model to resurrect in Assimilation Swarm when you can get an interesting enhancement for the Hive Tyrant that's leading them perhaps, or perhaps make an unusually big scary Synapse unit for Synaptic Nexus to effect, given the Hive Tyrant or Swarm Lord in tow. Overall, I think they're pretty reasonable for the upgrade really, but just maybe aren't really seen as super essential. For Hive Tyrants and things, you could just try and hide them as best as possible for the first few turns, keep them behind terrain but still within range to use buffs and stratagems and things, and then just use the model as a sort of late game threat when that starts to become less relevant than the early game damage dealing. For that reasons, they often tend to get passed up in competitive lists, but I feel like if you really wanted to, then they could allow you to use the Hive Tyrant or Swarm Lord far more aggressively. Next up, for 55 points, we've got the Barb Gaunts. They're quite good counter horde with 5 blasts at d6 shots and strength 5. With multiple copies of blast, it means that you'll get loads of extra hits against any ranked up infantry type units, so should be able to do disproportionate damage to any big infantry squads out there. For one infantry unit hit, they get -2 to move, advance and charge, which can be absolutely massive for close range enemy melee damage dealers. Could be the difference between them making a charge and not being able to do so. And the durability is kind of fine for 11 points. 2 wounds at toughness 4 with a 4+ save does die to a lot of things, but it's not really like they cost too much to start with. Unless horde melee armies go literally everywhere in the meta, I feel like they're probably not a unit you want too many of. Perhaps just maybe taking 5 of them along to debuff one important enemy unit, while they're also doing screening and grunt work. Next up we've got the Psychophage for 95 points. The big hungry bug gets a 6+ feel no pain type aura, and that's quite nice to have in the centre of formation. It should make the rest of the Tyranids around it just a little bit harder to take out, and the opponent doesn't usually want to be shooting this guy first as he's low threat and also unusually tanky for 95 points. 10 wounds with a 5+ feel no pain means on average that you'd have to chew through 15 wounds worth of Psychophage before it actually gets destroyed. Could be nice enough to have in the front ranks of monsters perhaps to take fire first, and just be an annoying nuisance even if he's not going to deal too much damage to anything. For his attacks, he gets a slightly weakish flamer style attack, plus some anti-psycho melee with devastating wounds. I feel like he only gets to being okay-ish in close combat, even against psychers though, given that the anti-psycho is on a 4+ now. Overall, I'd say he's a unit that you might want to take one of, but I certainly wouldn't take more for most armies. I suppose the Simulation Swarm might consider it, as again he's a keyworded unit there. For the most part, people seem not to be as impressed by the Feel No Pain unless they're running some very heavy frontline monster type lists, and even then you might be better off with just more dangerous monsters. They'll still add some durability on the board and a lot more threat than him. At 95 points though, I don't think he's as standout bad as he used to be. Next up we've got the Tyranid Prime as the leader from the Leviathan box set. He leads either gargoyles or warriors. He gets 6 attacks now with strength 7 with the synapse buff, AP 1 and damage 2, and also gives sustained hits for his unit, which is a bit more important for the warriors than the gargoyles really. His profile isn't terrible, but also not really very general purpose. Will be alright against standard Space Marines and things that are lighter, but nothing with high toughness or high saves. He's also not very tough in his own right either, no invulnerable save, and not that hard to take down if his unit does get torn away. He could make gargoyles have a little bit more skirmish melee threat as they do their moving around up the board, could give them a few more options. He does provide cheap synapse as well. And he does do a fair few things for Tyranid warriors if you wanted to use them, bearing enhancements, being a bit more dangerous with the sustained hits. He adds Vanguard Invader to them in the Vanguard Onslaught, and having a 12-inch move range does mean that he can sort of range ahead of the unit a little bit and ultimately shorten their charge range slightly. And that's not too bad for being a slightly gamey but interesting way of delivering them to combat. I feel like perhaps if warriors were a little bit more of a common competitive pick, then he might be genuinely interesting for that. At the moment though, he is still a slightly niche choice. Next, for 80 points, there's the Parasite of Mortrex. He's a speedy lone operative that moves 12 inches, which are generally handy to have on the board. Can be nice for doing actions or screening and things, and knowing the opponent just can't deal with him unless they catch up with him. He recently acquired Synapse, which slightly boosted his melee threat and can be handy for other things nearby. He has a bit of anti-infantry type damage, including a slightly unreliable chance to spawn Rippers if he gets a kill with his Ovipositor, and also a battle shock test in the fight phase, which I guess could be alright in combination with Neurolictors, though that's quite a lot of expensive lone operatives that you're buying if you do that. I still say he's in a position where he's not awful, but still really faces stiff competition from all the other Lictor variants out there. I would probably rate him as the weakest of the 4 Tyranid lone operative units. Moving upwards to Tier 2, and it still seems that Biovore hasn't dropped off too badly in terms of being played in competitive, even if the primary role that people are using him for isn't quite as good anymore, as the spore mines that he farms out can't do things like deploying teleport homers or actions and things. Despite this though, they're not completely dead for secondaries. You can still use them to do engage on all fronts or behind enemy lines which aren't tied to either objective control or to actions or anything, plus can genuinely be helpful for winning the mission through just screening areas of the board. You can fire spore mines at anywhere that you'd want to deny deep strike at next turn. And potentially they could be absolutely massive on the first turn of the game if you can stop the enemy from advancing within 6 inches of you. That might block certain units from being able to get onto objective markers at all without advancing, and force them to either charge the spore mine with likely a really long charge, or just not have any chance to be scoring that objective when they get to their turn 2. I feel like between that and the Biovore dropping down to 50 points, they've actually done not too badly out of this. The Biovore can still be at least a somewhat durable unit to hold the backfield and spawn other annoying units to still give you board control, and just every so often a little tiny bit of indirect fire could be absolutely game changing, potentially if the Biovore had the option where one devastating wound would make the difference between downing a Chaos Knight or something on its last bit of health. It'd be very unlikely to, but if it did get lucky, then occasionally indirect fire can really change games. I still not take more than one of them, but given they're just 50 points, it's really not the biggest stretch, and I've still seen people running them in competitive since the update. Next up, for 210 points, we've got the Winged Hive Tyrant. I'd probably rank this one in Tier 2 for most attachments, going up to Tier 1 in the Vanguard Onslaught, given that it's one of the biggest and scariest Vanguard invaders. It moves faster than the standard Hive Tyrant on foot, can have fairly threatening strength 10 melee, or swap it out for a Venom Cannon if you want to play more cagey with it. That -1 CP for stratagems within 12 inches was kind of big for Hive Tyrants, as it just means that all sorts of units will have all sorts of free options, and you can choose the best one in the turn, including things like free Overwatch, heroic intervention, or one command point, counter-offensive interrupt. His -1 attacks debuff could be quite big against the right opponents as well, particularly things with low levels of quite high quality attacks, maybe things like Orc Kill Saws perhaps, and he could be quite nice with some of the Vanguard Invader type options, maybe things like stopping shooting at greater than 18 inches to keep him safe, or you could take the stealth enhancement on that one if you wanted a little bit more durability at range. Otherwise though, definitely a model that needs to play a little bit cagey. Even with his 2+ save and 4+ invulnerable, he is not really all that tough per point if he gets exposed, and enemy anti-tank will have a good time shooting him. Next up, it's nice to see people actually using the Swarm Lord in competitive lists again. 240 points for the Alpha Hive Tyrant. In the balance update, he got a couple of very nice buffs. His stratagem debuff rule was now increased to increasing command point cost for enemy units within 12 inches, and if he is in a fairly threatening location on the board, then that could affect quite a chunk of the enemy army. Overall, as a model that could well be pushing forward and doing a lot of scary things with his close combat, I feel like he's one of the winners out of that one, and that could mean that enemy units really have to pick and choose their stratagems, as they're not going to have as many options for some of their very best things fighting in the midboard. Otherwise, he also generates the Tyranids themselves a command point per turn while he's alive, which is extra value. Gets mass strength 10 twin-linked melee with bone sabers, given that he's always in synapse range. A fairly useful psychic shooting attack, and maybe could run with Tyrant Guard if you wanted to be able to keep him a bit safer as he's moving into the midboard and getting that command point debuff in his melee to work. Overall, he feels a lot more useful than he was previously, and kind of interesting to see a few competitive lists choosing to take him as well. I think I would be kind of tempted to run him with Tyrant Guard to be able to play with him a little bit more aggressively. I feel like you need to make use of both his command point rules and also his melee damage at this kind of points cost. For 35 points, there's the Pyrovore. 35 points for a nice, cheap, and tough for the cost screening unit. 5 wounds at toughness 6 with a 3+ save is very good for that cost. And given it's quite tough, it's fairly good at repelling enemy lighter infantry with a bunch of twin-linked torrent attacks. Seems nice enough just to have lurking around your deployment zone for screening, maybe threatening to do actions on objectives and things if it's helpful. Or you could put it in strategic reserve to be able to do screening on the front lines, just annoy some enemy infantry with torrent things, or turning up to do actions if needed. His flame also hands out quite a meaningful debuff. Stripping cover from an enemy unit that it hits is kind of handy when it's on a 35 point unit that's got other uses as well. If you absolutely need to go to town on something with high saves with a bunch of exocrines or something, then he could make the difference between quite a lot of damage gained or lost. For that reason, I feel like one of them in an army list really seems like a bad choice at all, particularly if you've got a fair bit of shooting. And again, if you happen to be playing Assimilation Swarm, they're extra good there as they get the keyword. For 100 points per 3 of them, we've got the Zoanthropes, the Tyranid floating brain beasts that have a fair bit of anti-tank firepower with lethal hits, or you can swap that out to blast anti-elite damage depending on their target. Either way, they do put out a fair bit of reliable firepower. It's quite nice for Tyranids to get some dedicated anti-tank. They get an aura of a 6+ invulnerable save, which occasionally is relevant but often isn't given cover. It's not nothing though, and they themselves get a 4+ invulnerable save, which often can tank some surprising damage, though it is very unreliable and the unit is a bit hit and miss whether it goes down quite quickly. In the balance update, they gained the ability to run alongside the Neura Tyrant in the same unit. He can give them a +1 to hit. and potentially a +1 to wound if their target gets battle shocked as well, which is very nasty. And weirdly enough can give them big guns never tire rules as written at the moment, which doesn't really feel like it's a particularly intended consequence. I'm not sure if that might get patched out, but if you're allowed to play that way, then it makes the unit quite a lot better. Being tagged in close combat is definitely one of their biggest weaknesses. Otherwise they are a little bit slow and a little bit short range, so might be a bit more limited to drawing a bead on things in the midfield, not the backfield. And they could be a nice unit for the Synaptic Nexus for the reroll stratagem. Rerolling ones to hit and wound does make their firepower very nice, and it synergizes quite well with the range that they can throw it out at. Overall they feel like a fairly usable firepower unit, though definitely do have their downsides. Next up we've got the Tyranids at 190 points, the great big walking living battle tanker, the Tyranids. Very good durability for the cost with basically Land Raider sort of stat lines for significantly less than a Land Raider. 16 wounds at toughness 12 and a 2+ save, and a once per game ability to basically nullify attack and make that damage 0. It's good durability for the points, and it can actually contribute a little bit meaningfully to holding objectives as well. It gets OC 5. For its weapons, the two good ones now are either the Acid Spray or the Rupture Cannon. Previously most competitive lists tended to go for the Acid Spray for some nice mid-board overwatch that can threaten things like Space Marines fairly well. Certainly not super high on damage, but is just generally pretty handy and can chip away at the opponent and move it forward to force them to deal with its defensive profile. Since the balance update though, that Rupture Cannon's looking a lot more interesting. 2 shots at massive strength and damage d6+6 with good AP, definitely a gun that can swing high or low and get unlucky, but anytime it rolls well there's a reasonable chance that it could just one-shot an enemy tank, which is really quite scary and intimidating to play against. Overall I would rate it fairly solidly, definitely a little bit more defense versus damage, at least for its points cost, even counting for that scary Rupture Cannon. It does have competition for Tyranid firepower though, with the very general purpose Exocrines and Maliceptors. Next up for 140 points there's the regenerating monstrosity Old One-Eye. He has a Carnifex stat line with a 5+ feel no pain for a lot more effective wounds on his profile there. It means it's effectively 50% harder to kill than a regular one. And then if you manage to half kill him, then he'll regenerate those wounds, which is extra nice with a good save and the 5+ feel no pain. In melee he gets some fairly terrifying damage d6+1 anti-tank style attacks, and as mentioned for the Carnifexes he gives them reroll hits for them, which will also mean that he can reroll hits while he's leading a unit, and just makes his entire squad a lot more dangerous. At 140 points he's considered both good enough to run solo or to lead a couple of Carnifexes up the board if you want a really big scary big investment unit. Perhaps for his downsides he's not really super fast and he's limited to just melee only, so he's a little bit more limited scope and does have the potential to take a fair bit of firepower or maybe get screened or move blocked by outline chaff enemy units. Overall though, a fairly strong monster, a good amount of durability and damage, and a good buffing rule. Next up we've got the Trigon and Morlock, great big deep striking menaces that have recently gained the Vanguard Invader keyword. I'd probably rate them tier 3 outside of the Vanguard Onslaught, maybe borderline tier 2 or tier 1 within it. Being able to use their powerful stratagems and advance and charge on big scary models like this is rather nice. The Trigon's the more expensive of the two, with a bunch of damage 3 attacks in melee, which could go up to strength 10 if you can get in Synapse, that often does like to operate a bit more independently. The Trigon's thing is a 3-inch deep strike rule, which can often be really impactful, means that it could be kind of hard to screen out if you wanted to use it to get behind enemy lines potentially, or just have it pop up in a really annoying space where the opponent's going to struggle to deal with it, potentially with rapid ingress, and then go to town on them with a charge the next turn. The Morlock's also far more interesting in Vanguard Onslaught. It gets a big 16 attacks against Hordes as base, strength 8, AP 2 and damage 1 that will go through Space Marines and anything of 1 wound infantry, but won't do quite as well against tough stuff. The Morlock's trick is to cause some damage on Deep Strike though as it tunnels up. A good chance for a bunch of mortal wounds to things that are within 12 inches of it when it deep strikes, and potentially if it rolls well you could be getting perhaps a surprising amount of mortal wounds on the enemies that are near there. Both of them are very interesting with the Vanguard Invader return to reserve type thing. That means they could potentially disappear to strike anew, maybe even with rapid ingress if you're feeling a bit spendy on the CP. Definitely could be hugely disruptive and pick off isolated parts of the enemy's army and disappear if it makes sense to them. Next up we've got the Venomthropes for 70 points, a pretty cheap durability buffing unit. 3 bodies with 3 wounds that give the benefit of cover within 6 inches and stealth to any non-monsters within 6 inches as well. They can also do a bit of counter infantry sort of charging later in the game if it makes sense to. Probably makes most sense to keep them hidden early on. But if you come across some infantry with some lowish saves, they get 5 attacks each with AP 0 and damage 1 and anti-infantry 2+, so you can definitely stack a whole load of armor saves on the right thing. I feel like for 70 points they're pretty reasonable enough to have in the middle of a formation. I feel perhaps a little bit less meaningful for monsters, given that for the most part cover isn't the hardest thing to come by in 10th edition, so sometimes it'll be useful, sometimes they won't. I guess they could make positioning just a little bit more free. Nice enough for supporting infantry and keeping them a little bit tougher though, I suppose. Next up, we've got the Broodlord and Gene Stealers. The Broodlord's 80 points, the Gene Stealers 75 points per 5 of them. They're a scouty vanguard type unit that can scout 8 inch forward and have a good 8 inch movement, so can potentially threaten first turn charges, again particularly in Vanguard Onslaught that allows you to advance and charge. The Gene Stealers at 75 points can just be quite a nice mid-board skirmishing type unit with a bunch of strength 4 and AP 2 melee attacks that should hopefully be able to drag down 1 wound infantry or maybe some space marines. They get some inbuilt rerolls of 1 that get better when you target things on objectives. The Broodlord now grants Synapse as you gain that in the balanced data slate, and that means that the Gene Stealers that he leads now go up to Strength 5, which is quite a nice breakpoint against things like Space Marines, Terminators, and Orc Boys and things. And he also gives them devastating wounds and his own general purpose melee, with a bunch of damage 2 and twin linked attacks. I certainly consider them one of the top tier most interesting units for Vanguard Onslaught, really quite threatening, particularly given the Strength 5 gain. Quite a big and dangerous unit that's quite a nice option to use stratagems on. I feel like cheap units of Gene Stealers aren't awful for skirmishing type things, probably rivaling Von Ryan's Leapers for that role though. Next up, for 125 points, we've got the big hungry Haruspex, a fairly big, chunky, cheap, and easy enough to use melee monster with a surprising amount of attacks. 14 wounds at toughness 11 I think is fairly good durability for the 125 points. It can feel maybe a little bit less good than you might hope for if it's right on the front line though. Any dedicated anti-tank firepower like las cannons can make some fairly short work of it. In close combat it hits hard with 4 anti-tank style attacks and then 14 attacks at strength 7 AP 1 damage 2 to cut down a bunch of enemy infantry, so it should be good enough to take out some big swathes of forces, plus a fun sniping attack with its grasping tongue, which if it gets lucky it might be able to take out a unit leader. It is a bit slow for delivering it into melee with just an 8 inch move, so it's odds on going to be exposed to take damage before it gets to charge, which isn't ideal. For the most part they tend to be far more commonly seen in casual play versus competitive. They're very easy to use monsters with fairly good stats both on the damage and defensive type front, but they often just maybe don't really tend to trade enormously well with other enemy units in practical competitive play. Maybe not quite enough threats to utterly destroy very scary enemy melee units and stop it getting hit back hard. Maybe just due to the fact that it is quite a cheap monster. Maybe means it can't take damage quite as well as some things out there. I still rate it as overall very usable though. Next up, we've got some swarms in the Termagants and Hormagaunts. The Termagants are 60 points and the Hormagaunts are 65, and that gets you 10 bodies with a 5+ save, either a little bit of shooting or some melee damage. They're both high objective control, so it can be quite nice just to move onto midfield objectives and maybe try and keep them out of line of sight so the opponent has to move forward with something meaningful to trade with them. The Termagants can potentially counterattack lighter things with a bit of anti-light infantry sort of volume fire, Spine Fists being the most popular. Maybe some of their special weapons if you can be bothered with them. And they also have their reactive move, which occasionally could be really quite big, potentially recoiling from enemy charges, or even just moving up towards objectives if that makes more sense. On the other hand, Hormagaunts can really rush fast. They've got a good base movement and then able to advance and charge, so they can cover a fairly frightening amount of the board. Quite nice for being able to reliably rush onto a mid-board objective and then hopefully flip it with a good amount of objective control if they survive. Both of them really like the unending swarm detachment, which gives them all sorts of support, particularly the sort of surge move type things can make them a real nuisance for objective skirmishing if suddenly they're in combat and you can't shoot them anymore. Kind of a shame about the reinforcement style stratagem just being once per game though. Otherwise they do have some competition from the Gargoyles, which tend to be the first choice for OC2 battle line units for Tyranids, but they are significantly cheaper than those now at least. Overall, I'd say they're usable, but it's kind of rare to see them in any massive numbers, maybe small units to just support a bit of objective play. Finally, for this tier, I've chosen to rank the Neurogaunts here. 45 points of incredibly cheap screening chaff. I think has good advantage all of its own. It's just quite nice to have a unit that's quite so spectacularly cheap and can take up really quite a big area of the board. Means that you can screen deep strike in your own deployment zone pretty well, or even just have them as a trading unit kind of taken to the next level. They still put 11 OC on an objective if you want to, and with 11 bodies in the squad they are going to take at least a little bit of focused fire to bring down the unit, which I feel like is almost always going to feel more effort than it's worth to the opponent, given that these guys are less than 50 points for the whole squad of them. Hopefully if they're needing to bring these guys down, then that firepower is soaked up from more important things. A special rule allows them to transmit synapse as well, and that's a bit more important than it used to be, so might have a little bit of secondary function for that. Obviously their main weakness is they just don't really do any damage to any sort of meaningful degree, and for that reason I wouldn't really want too many of them, as it's usually best to only really go with so many points towards those kind of units. Finally, you do have the option of guarding the Neurotyrant with them, but most people choose not to do that, given that the Neurotyrant's kind of cheap in its own right, and for its cost not really all that easy to kill given an invulnerable save, plus it does mean that you have the chance of taking a bunch of wounds that were wounded against toughness 3 on the Neurotyrant itself when the last of the squad gets wiped out, and sometimes that could be really quite a negative if it loses loads of health against a high volume anti-infantry attack that wipes them out. Finally though, for tier 1, here are the units that I'd probably rank as top tier for Tyranids right now. All really quite strong datasheets, though I'd still say they're not absolutely enormously ahead of the stuff in tier 2. Exocrines still seem to be pretty sturdy as the go-to general purpose gun turret of choice for Tyranids. D6 plus 3 shots, now all the way up at strength 9, AP 3 and damage 3 with both blast and heavy. It means that they're relevant both against hordes and also get better when stationary, and the AP3 damage 3 profile is pretty excellent for destroying elite infantry of most varieties. They've got enough AP and damage to be chipping away against heavy tanks and things as well, and will particularly like either Invasion Fleet or the Hive Tyrants to allow lethal hits as well, as that just rounds them out really nicely, both being good anti-elite and also a lot more likely to stack damage on tanks. 14 wounds at toughness 10 is solid enough toughness for 135 points, and they also mark a unit for reroll ones to hit as well. So potentially if you have a battery of them, the first one can spot the same target for the next two if you just want to launch all your damage into something really big and tough. Still seems like they're a very common include in Tyranid competitive list right now. Just easy to use with good damage and good defense. Next up, for Gargoyles, they pay a bit more of a premium than they used to, but for 85 points they can be a really good way to guarantee some objective scoring when you need it. Quite a fun unit that does have different options on ways to play as well. They've got a 12-inch move, the fly keyword, they can deep strike and move, shoot, move, and all of that means that they're great for objectives. Potentially it means that you can deep strike them outside of 9 inches and then shoot and then use that 6-inch secondary move that they get, potentially meaning that if your opponent hasn't deployed squarely on an objective, you could potentially even sneak it away from them. Given that bonus movement, they essentially have 18 inches of movement plus an advance each turn as well. So they could just swoop up the board from being in a really threatening space and do annoying first turn move blocks so the opponent's army can't advance towards you. They could just use that good movement to get into a nice safe place on the board to put that objective control on objectives as well and force the opponent to try and move up to get behind terrain to see you. And then an interesting unit both for Vanguard Onslaught with the Invader keyword and Unending Swarm as well as being perhaps one of the best units to recycle for the 2 command point cost, even if you can only do it once. Could be quite nice to play big with a unit of 20 of them, force the opponent to delete them all after they've gotten away for a turn and maybe scored some points, and then they just come back from deep strike next turn anyway. Again, they pay a premium for their utility, so don't deal too much damage, but really nice to have maybe 1 or 2 units of them for all the objective plays. Next up, we've got the 3 flavours of Tyranid Lictor, the Nids being kind of spoilt for choice for infiltrating lone operatives. I feel like post-update they're maybe not quite as much of an auto-include must-have unit as otherwise, though most lists choose to run at least one type of these. They're maybe not spamming them too heavily, though I feel like you can get away with doing so if you want to. Having infiltrating lone operatives that move kind of fast in the midfield, again, is just pretty handy. Excellent for doing secondary objectives and just doing annoying screening things where shooting can't catch up with them. They can be very annoying to take off the board between terrain and their durability or fights first rules. For the standard lictors, they're only at 55 points, very cheap and dangerous for a lone operative. They have fights first with a bunch of strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 precision attacks, which could be enough to threaten to kill a character in a pinch. It's just not awful anti-space marine type attacks though, and quite nice that you get the damage if they get charged as he gets to fights first against the enemy. Standard lictors I think could be handy enough just to have cheap lone operatives infiltrating, but they can have a 0 CP rapid ingress if they want to. If that makes sense, then it could mean that you could get the jump on an enemy unit that really doesn't want to be fighting a lictor. Otherwise, Death Leaper's 80 points, so paying a big 25 point tax. The main thing that he gets is extra durability, a 4+ invulnerable save, a 3+ base save, and 7 wounds rather than 6 mean that he's a lot trickier to take down than a standard one. And he does give you a good chance of handing out some extra battle shock tests for any damaged units in the midboard. With that and a leadership debuff, if he can be within 6 inches of an objective, there can be a much better chance for enemies to fail, particularly combined with things like Shadow in the Warp or maybe Neurolictors backing him up. Speaking of which, the Neurolictors are really quite an expensive unit now, all the way up at 90 points, but if anything have even better utility now they gained the Synapse keyword, so they can just be quite nice to have hidden so they can't be shot or charged too easily. And even if they can with a 4+ invulnerable save, they could bounce some attacks. Their damage output is kind of low with only damage 1 attacks and they don't fight first, but instead they have some fairly godly battle shock type rules, being able to hand out a test to one unit within 12 inches in your command phase, which can stop an opponent from contesting an objective against you, which is kind of big. And then also doubling down on that by actually making failed battle shock a lot more meaningful. Enemies within 12 inches are -1 to hit, and you also +1 to wound with your units against them. And that can be good with their base special rule, plus anything else that generates battle shock, like the Shadow in the Warp, or maybe even the Screamer Killer Khan effects. I feel like for the most part you probably want to take some of these, but not all of them, given that if you just go too crazy on them, you're going to take a bit too much away from primary damage and defense type units in the army. But they can give some fairly godly board control, and all have a whole load more options in Vanguard Onslaught as well, as all of them are Vanguard invaders. Next up we have the Neurotyrant for 105 points. He also makes Shadow in the Warp far better. Having a -1 debuff on that means that enemies are a lot more likely to fail. You're probably going to get another 2 or 3 enemy units fail battle shock on the turn that you trigger it in 2,000 point games, obviously depending on the size and number of the enemy units of course. And then beyond that, it can be quite nice to have somewhere lurking in the deployment zone, pushing out Synapse range to a longer range, and then once his Shadow debuff is used, he's just a fairly tanky monster with a 4+ invulnerable save for a cheapish cost, and then 2d6 strength 5, AP 1 and damage 2 torrent attacks. Those torrent attacks can be far more dangerous with the Synaptic Nexus enhancement that he can take that's nice and cheap. That's pretty much an auto-include there I'd say. And as mentioned earlier, he can now also run with zone tropes as well, giving them +1 to hit and a further +1 to wound against battle shocked things. Also technically big guns never tire as well, given that it's a rule that applies to the unit but you don't check it on a per model basis, so potentially means that zone tropes can still fire in melee, which is kind of huge. Again, I feel like that might get patched at some stage, but it hasn't at time of recording. Overall, I feel like they're rarely a bad choice to have, maybe lurking in the deployment zone, spreading the Synapse around, use the Shadow, and potentially repel any interlopers with that torrent. Next up we've got the standard Hive Tyrant, 235 points with a big Venom Cannon and a Bone Sword for the most choices, a bit of nice anti-elite, melee and range respectively. He is quite a pricey leader, but also really quite a scary one with some massive buffing abilities. Getting an aura of assault and lethal hits is great for nearby firepower. As mentioned, Exocrines in particularly like that. It might mean that they can get some lines of sight a bit better with boosted movement, and lethal hits against heavy stuff is big. The stratagem changes I think also worked out in his favour, getting -1 to the cost of stratagems for any Tyranid unit within 12 inches once per turn is a really big buffing ability, with all sorts of interesting options to support things nearby, things like free overwatch or heroic intervention, or cheaper counter-offensive, or even just command rerolls, or the 5+ feel no pain from invasion fleets. It's generally going to be an interesting unit for any enhancements, particularly ones that can help out durability like the Feel No Pain in Invasion Fleet once more. And in general, I feel like it's best off playing kind of cagey for the first few turns, making sure that he can get his free stratagems and buffs to work, and then being a little bit more adventurous later on to get his damage dealing profile right to work on the enemy in the closing stages of the battle, and where it doesn't matter as much when he's killed. If possible, he just doesn't want to get taken down immediately, as he's going to be a huge priority at that much points cost for a 10 wound monster, even if he does get an invulnerable save. Finally, last but not least, we have the Maliceptor, 170 points for the monstrous Brain Bug. He gets a big psyche attack with d6 plus 3 shots at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3, though fairly short ranged at 18 inches. Again, like the Exocrine, he'll get on pretty well with the Hive Tyrant's aura. Being able to advance and shoot that can give you a fair few more options, plus lethal hits definitely isn't the worst if he happens to be attacking anything that's toughness 11 or 12. Unlike the Exocrine, he's a bit more capable of being on the front lines. He's got a bit of melee with some strength 10, AP 2 and damage d6 plus 1 attacks, or the option to sweep. Gets a 4+ invulnerable save to repel some heavy anti-tank firepower, and also has a fairly useful -1 to hit within 6 inches of him, which means that he's not quite as easy to take down in melee as some of the other Tyranid monsters out there. And that also goes to a -1 to wound if the enemy is below half strength for some reason, which situationally could make him very hard to take down by them. He also provides Synapse as well, which is more useful than it was previously. And again, I think it's quite a nice unit to have on the front line for maybe Synaptic Nexus. The Invasion Fleet and other ones can certainly do well with him too. Definitely a bit pricier, but quite a nice generalist to go venturing into the midfield. With those tier 1 units talked about though, that just about brings us to the end of this Tyranid tier list. Let me know what you make of the tiers and selections. Would you have ranked anything a little bit higher or lower? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below, and what's been working on the table for you well since the big Tyranid update. As mentioned, if you were picking up any 40k kits of one sort or another, feel free to check out the discount retailers down in the video description. I'll leave a link to them below, and it does help to support the channel. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I'll certainly hope to be doing a few more Tyranids things in the next few weeks. Maybe a look at some army lists and perhaps an updated start collecting video. So feel free to stay tuned if you'd like to see that. Finally, if you've been enjoying the videos and you'd like to support the channel a bit more directly, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the main reason that I can keep on doing this as my full-time thing. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.